Hey, Vanessa.
Hey, Dom. How goes?
I'm at the everything pisses me off stage of the day, maybe of the week, maybe of life.
Maybe.
Will something not piss me off in the future? Who knows?
I'm in the just getting over a hangover part of the day, which is way too late in the day to just be getting over the hangover. So I guess it's mildly better than the rest of the day. So that's
you had
okay.
to therapeutically leave the city in order to reach that stage. Apparently,
no, I was very queasy in the rural lands of Long Island, but I returned. I ate, and now I feel more like myself.
Humanoid,
yes.
Human adjacent,
more humanoid, less angry than a Dom.
So to hopefully ameliorate said rage, we have today the brilliant Christine Rosen.
Yep. Christine is a senior fellow at AEI, co-host of the Commentary podcast, and also a senior writer at Commentary magazine. And she was an excellent guest.
Did you mention co-host of Commentary podcast?
I did.
Wow, I should listen to you next time. She's one of those people that I've been just waiting for the right excuse to invite.
Yeah.
So the excuse was her recent article about trauma. So if you all listened to our episode with Misha Thomas from ages ago, you'll know that I have a problem. I've been having this repressed anger about the overuse and oversaturation of trauma as a concept in the public discourse, in day-to-day use, in the media, political analysis, just trauma everywhere.
And in policy increasingly too.
It's something that I had a visceral reaction to, but never took the time to seriously flesh out. And thankfully now I don't need to, because Christine did that. So in addition to a deep trauma being overrepresented in popular culture and what the pernicious effects of this are, we also talked about our favorite topic, media, and its obsession with panic porn.
And the general gloominess of media. I mean, what Christine does at Commentary is keep an eye on what the outlets are doing. And one of the
Big O outlets.
Big O? What is that?
The outlets. It's like the apps.
The outlets.
Regime.
I think, or you say Big O, I think of Oprah, but or orgasms. That's what comes to mind. Anyway, back on track. She points out that the particularly in left-leaning media, but not exclusively, the gloominess of it all, and that really resonated with me.
They are dour, aren't they?
We talked about history a little bit.
Oh yes. So Christine, who's a historian by education, literally wrote the book about eugenics. Not the how-to book so much as the historical review of eugenics as an intellectual movement.
Could you imagine?
For the how-to, you'd have to look somewhere else, I'm afraid.
No, this is not.
So I'm not sure that's a podcast for you. Yeah.
I know. All of a sudden, all the eugenics supporters are unsubscribing in anger on certain things.
And for our paid subscribers, we are going to have a special post-trauma conversation. Just Vanessa and I riffing on some aspects that we didn't get to drill into with Christine, specifically this concept of trauma plot in fiction narratives. So if you want more about trauma and our feels and thoughts about it, you can subscribe to us on uncertain.substack.com, and paid subscribers get the tasty additional content.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's a draw or not, but we're going to actually put on a video camera for those, so you'll get to see our faces.
Definitely not a draw.
That's, we're going to get, they're all going to come a-running now to see what we look like and why we're doing radio.
Exactly. Sign up to in the regular places if you want to support us. 5 stars on Apple Podcasts goes a long way. And share us with your friends and enemies. And with that,
Christine Rosen. We have a lot of questions for you.
We'll probably get to question number 2.
Yeah, I know.
So Christine, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be on.
You have a background in history, right?
Yes.
And I think, if I'm not totally mistaken, so when I was we undergrad in history in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. One of my projects was to write the wiki page in Hebrew about eugenics. And I'm pretty sure you were one of my sources in that development. I was actually going to ask you not about eugenics, like eugenics, good or bad, but I wanted your thought as somebody with a thorough, in-depth background in history. What's your feeling about the place of history in the public discourse right now?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think about this a lot in private, but when I try to talk to people about it, particularly people who think, oh yeah, history is that class I took. I know a little bit of it. I occasionally read a political biography, so I'm well informed. I think it's nowhere near as centered in the public discourse as it needs to be. And the reason I say that is the kinds of terms and the kinds of phrases and words we use to describe current events are often heavily freighted with history. And we're kind of throwing these terms around like authoritarian and fascist and, all kinds of very strong words that have particularly historical meanings and that have a real deep past that should inform our discussion and our use of it. And so there's a lot of hubris in our invocation of history and not a lot of depth in our understanding of how complicated those histories are. They don't necessarily prove what either side wants them to prove. They're used in incredibly instrumental ways, particularly by political figures that I find obscures more than it reveals about the past and about the present. So I'm concerned. It's also a field that has, it has some politicization issues that have emerged. And so there are people who claim to speak for an entire field that really have no business speaking for anyone but themselves, particularly on social media. So we all could do with some more history, but in the sense of studying those parts of the past for which we have contemporary interests. So if you're, for example, someone who's just lived through a pandemic, it might be useful to go back and reread about, early 20th century responses to the Spanish flu, or to read about how other countries and other civilizations have dealt with these kind of seismic changes. It gives perspective, but what it mainly gives is something we definitely don't have in public discourse these days, and that's humility.
I was macetating humility ahead of you. So I was like, yep, that's the thing.
But what's worse,
because when you really study history, and I'm going to let you finish your question, Vanessa, but it's just when you actually get into the field seriously, that's the thing you get, that the more you learn, the more you feel, tempered in the kind of political and ideological certainties that you had when you entered into it. Because you see the things are rich and complex. And when you try to just place them into a single narrative, it's fun and it's a fun exercise, but you also discover how easy it is to do, which makes you doubt the veracity of attempts to do so. Anyway, Vanessa.
Oh, I was going to say, well, I was struck by your answer in that it sounded like a lot of what you were saying was we have too little history in the public discourse, but you could also make the argument that we have too much poor history in the public discourse, right? So what's worse?
Oh, I like that. Yes, I like that. That's a better way of putting it. I agree. And I'll say my argument for humility is a personal story, because when I went into the archives to study what motivated a bunch of pretty well-educated, seemingly well-intentioned people in the United States to start practicing eugenics and start trying to prevent people from having children because they thought those children would be so-called feeble-minded, I had to really set aside my own contemporary assumptions, and I read their letters, and you read the kind of complicated self-rationalizations they made, and some of it was not persuasive to me, but some of it helped me really understand just how complicated they were. And what history should teach us is that there are some consistencies, mainly with regard to human nature, what we kind of tend to do either as individuals and particularly as groups, as nation states. That's where I think the humility needs to come in. But Vanessa, I love that phrasing, because that's actually quite right. We have a lot of history talk, but we don't actually have a lot of understanding of the past.
So what's your feelings when you hear about the historians crowding the White House and sharing counsel about the destiny of the Biden administration?
I think so. Look, I am not an academic historian by practice. I have a lot of friends who are still in academia who teach, and they're professors and they love it. They love their jobs. They're wonderful teachers. They love their students. But there is always a little bit of a kind of if you're a historian, you kind of work in the shadows, right? You're in the background, you're slogging away in the archives, you're writing your books, you're teaching your students. To be invited to the White House to tell a sitting president what they should think about is incredibly intoxicating. I will note that Sean Wilentz was one of the historians there. I admire his work very much. But Michael Beschloss is a TV historian. That's what I would call him. He's written lots of great books. That's fine. But he's a pundit. He's a pundit more than he is a historian. He's a television figure more than he is a historian. I'm not sure the advice that a Michael Beschloss would give our current president is going to be all that better than our current president just reading some good history books. But I see the impulse. There's also, of course, if you're in power, if you're the president, regardless of your party or creed, the idea of gathering smart people around you and you're going to learn from them. I mean, it's a nice image. I just don't know how helpful historians are when it comes to daily policymaking and daily executive decision making. That's not really what history is supposed to be good at doing.
To be as generous as possible, the problem should be not with the idea of surrounding yourself with a variety of intellectuals. It's more a question maybe of how much variety is there. It's question number one, but also question number two, how you end up synthesizing it yourself. So it's the responsibility of the decision maker to not just say, well, Anne Applebaum said that democracy is ending and therefore I should pass another executive order to ban whatever, Fox News.
Right. And I admire Anne and her work a great deal as well, but yes.
She's a fantastic writer, and her writing about the developments in the former Soviet bloc is amazing. And it's also totally fine if she draws conclusions about what's going on in America. I often agree with her, but it's for a good leader to hear them out, but then synthesize it with more information and not just follow a grand narrative of history just because a few historians have reached a certain conclusion.
Well, and I will say my concern with the group, as this was described, by someone who obviously was there, immediately ran and told the Washington Post, which is what, this is how these things always occur. I was concerned by how much most of the people there are sort of on the record being pretty alarmist about our current situation and about the future health of our democracy. I don't share that alarmism. I have a lot of concerns. But I worried when I saw I'm like, these are all people who've been publicly kind of ringing a bell, and then that bell has one note. And the thing is, there are many notes to what's going on right now. And I hope he also brought in some people who had alternative views of the current situation.
So actually, the way we structured the interview, and this is classic us, one of the most uncertain things about uncertain things is the order of the conversation. So we really wanted to dive early on into your article about trauma, because this is something that I've been itching to talk about. We actually had one conversation with our friend and group psychologist, Misha Thomas, who we're going to bring up later in the conversation. But since you talked about the pessimism, I think this is a good pivot to your article about panic addiction, panic porn.
Yeah, I love that article that you wrote about. It was about the Atlantic specifically, and you had that one line that was like, "Wow, this is Eeyore meets Nietzsche shit right now," which I loved. I mean, you didn't say shit, but I'm paraphrasing.
I was thinking it so good.
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to talk about that article because I think, we can talk about it specifically with the Atlantic, and then we can also kind of extrapolate to what this doominess means beyond, right? Because I don't think the Atlantic is alone here. I am left-leaning. I consume left-leaning media, and the doominess is one of the things that has gotten most kind of overwhelming, I would say. And one of the joys of doing Uncertain Things is that we talk to people kind of more center-right-ish and who are less pessimistic about everything all the time. And so I guess to start, my first question for you is, what do you think this kind of trend on the liberal media side is doing to liberal brains? Because I see some real ramifications, and I'm curious to get your take on how you see it impacting.
And I'm just going to intercede, because that's another one of our trademarks, those intercessions. I'm just going to intercede quickly, because I don't think that the center-rights are necessarily more optimistic, but I think where we landed is that a general pessimism that comes with conservatism about human nature gives you a little more chill about, this is nothing new. Everything is the end of the world, so nothing is.
Right. So that's a good way of framing this. I will say I ended up writing about the Atlantic in particular because I am a loyal reader. I read broadly. I consider myself conservative, but I am not extreme right wing. But I read all across the aisle just because I'm curious. I think your views are not well held if you can't test them against the opposite view. So I just had noticed creeping into and I have friends, lovely friends who write for The Atlantic. So it's not a publication I have any sort of hatred for or anything, but it was bugging me. Like you said, Vanessa, it's like you notice it and you start going, well, why? Why is this happening? And I did notice that the top reads, how they rank all the articles if you go to their website, they were largely this kind of doomsaying and about everything, about the climate, about our politics, about leadership, about obviously during the pandemic, same thing. And it struck me that at first I thought it was going in this direction because of the pandemic. People were at home. They were doom scrolling, CDC bulletins and statistics every day. You're looking at your dashboard for COVID. It was a very stressful, historically unusual turn of events for people in this country, and obviously a very tragic one for many, many families who lost loved ones. So it struck me as kind of useful for the current mood. Then I thought, but wait a minute, because it's one thing to be pessimistic and doomsaying, but usually that's for a larger purpose. Like, okay, we're in a mess here. We've created a mess, or a mess has been pushed upon us. What do we do to fix it? What are our next steps? And The Atlantic has always had a kind of pragmatic, practical angle from its inception. The idea was it's engaging culture and policy at the same time across the broad middle. And it had a kind of that American pragmatic spirit was always something I loved about the magazine. And I didn't see that anywhere. I just saw hand-wringing and I just saw people waving their hands in horror. And it was a kind of a nonpartisan tone. So that's why I went after it, because I thought, enough wallowing. Why are we wallowing? We all know things are bad. We know where they're bad. What comes next? How do we have conversations, particularly nowadays across the aisle, about fixing this stuff? Because that's where I think a lot of Americans, just regular people who are not plugged into inside the Beltway politics or into any sort of extremes of culture, just the regular person who turns on the TV and sees all this doom and gloom, or scrolls through the internet and sees doom and gloom, and then their obvious thought is, okay, well, now what? And it's incumbent on our cultural elites to answer that question. And too often, and I absolutely include myself in this indictment, too often it's a lot more fun to point out all the errors. It's much harder to start trying to solve the problem. So I did that as an exercise, and this is what's frustrating me. Why are they doing this? And it was kind of heartening to hear from a lot of people, mainly on the left side of the aisle, who had exactly your reaction, Vanessa, which is, yeah, it's not just The Atlantic. There's a tone abroad in the land and in the broad middle of cultural products that's kind of depressing. And we needed to think about why that was the case. So that, and again, I go to the hyperbole of a lot of the language use. I think words matter. I'm a person who makes my living with words. Words matter. And I was really concerned about the kind of, the level of language that was used in a lot of these pieces that seemed like hyperbole to me, in a magazine that wasn't really known for hyperbole. It was known for excellent writing and thoughtful, sophisticated critique.
Yeah. And the way that I see it impacting the people around me, I think people tend to have two types of reactions to this onslaught of doominess. I think it's either this passivity, because it's like, whoa, I throw up my hands. How could I, even as a tiny person, even begin to help with this onslaught of terribleness everywhere, always, on the one hand? Or it's a very firebrandy, like, let's burn it all down. It's like, everything's terrible. We got to start over. And so I feel like these are the two streams that I see now on the liberal side, of partly as a result of all of this like overwhelming anxiety.
And increasingly the conservative side.
Yes. And I was going to say, yes, the conservatives have versions, less of the we can't do anything, we're just passive, more of the fire breathing, burn it all down.
Take an AR-15 to the FBI.
Yes, exactly. Like, I mean, no, that's absolutely right. And I think, honestly, one of the appeals during lockdown and I talked to a lot of friends who are avid, not just Atlantic readers, but, sort of making sure that I wasn't just overreacting to this tone. Was I seeing something that wasn't there? And they said something interesting to me. It's like, well, it's kind of a welcoming excuse to make for oneself. If things are so overwhelming, well, what can one little person do? It's like the recycling challenge versus global warming. You're like, well, is putting this can in this bag and putting it on the curb really going to change if we're all going to burn to death in 20 years? So, I mean, but the apocalypse, we are addicted to a kind of apocalyptic way of looking at what are actually complicated but practical problem. So you're absolutely right. I think that gives people a way to justify maybe not doing anything or a justification for unholy rage.
So one of the things that kind of I was also thinking though as I was reading the article was like a little bit of so what? Like if the Atlantic is selling subscriptions, if it's making money, it is a private enterprise. It's clearly getting traction with people. It's getting subscriptions by peddling and anxiety. So to a certain extent, it's like, well, that's its prerogative. If its audience has become, if this is what its audience wants and that's how they're going to make money, then so they should go forth and make this doom media.
How libertarian of you, Vanessa.
But then, of course, as I was thinking about like how to ask you about this question, I was like, well, of course, the other side of this is that it's not just the Atlantic. It's a lot of different liberal outlets that are peddling to the same exact small elite, peddling in the same exact anxieties. And I think that obviously creates less room for quote unquote regular people, non-elites, to find interesting quality media, and also gives these elites a very abstract awareness of what's actually happening in the world. There is no actual connection with what's happening to quote unquote regular people. But then my question for you is, what are we supposed to do about that? Because we have a private media system. We have an ad-based, subscription-based model for the media. I'm assuming you're not for a public system. So barring that, what is the solution to creating a more healthy media ecosystem?
No, it's not to overstrain the metaphor. I think that it makes me think of some of the lawsuits against drug companies and opiate manufacturers. How much should we hold them responsible for the opiate epidemic? There is a real addiction, and the addiction to doom scrolling and to read another article about how democracy is crumbling. And you can see that the threshold is constantly rising because it's no longer enough just to go to MSNBC and Fox News to get your partisan take. You need to go further. You need to go to Newsmax. You need to go to, I don't know, The Root. That's a form of real addiction. To what extent do you hold the manufacturers responsible for that?
That's a good question. And I think all of this, we're talking about how people read. And we all know, most of us probably do this ourselves. We read on a screen. We read on our phones. We get a lot of, most people under the age of 30 in this country don't read newspapers or even watch television. They watch TikTok, YouTube, and they, get all their news from social media links. Fine, that's the world we live in. But those platforms reward fear and anger above everything else. That's what drives engagement. Engagement to them is all that matters. It doesn't matter if it comes from happy puppies frolicking with cats or if it comes from, people writing their manifesto about how they're going to burn down the FBI. They'll take whatever gets more clicks. So that's the environment we live in. And I think why I was particularly harsh with an institution like The Atlantic is that they do hold themselves to a higher standard. They don't just say, we just publish a magazine and we, this is our ethos. It's, we are a brand that embodies the best of American culture. They put on an ideas festival. They have all these sort of, branded exercises and Atlantic type thinking, many of which are really good.
Lofty celebrations of the American dialect.
Exactly. But at those lofty celebrations, just as at like other lofty celebrations like Davos and the Aspen Ideas Festival, all you see are elites talking to other elites about how to solve the problems of that they do believe non-elites are causing them or the rest of the world. And that's where the democracy doomsaying gets me angry. That's where I come into the anger. I'm thinking people being outraged and doing kind of crazy stuff in a democracy has been going on. First of all, we get to the history point again. I mean, read a book about 19th century politics. We look tame by comparison today. We really still do. Like crazy stuff happened all the time in a young nation that didn't quite know what it was doing. And we're a bunch of hotheads. We're a violent people. This has been the case consistently since the founding. So that gives you perspective. But the difference now is that I feel the cultural institutions in this country are largely controlled by people who have a lot of background similarities, even if they're not, they don't look the same, but they are educated in similar institutions with similar values and similar ideas. They come out of those institutions with a worldview. And a lot of that is problem solving, which can be very useful and very good for society. But a lot more of it lately seems to be pointing at others who seem to be a problem because they're not on board with your worldview. And that's where the democratic clash is supposed to be healthy and productive because we have to come to some compromise about what the world should look like. And instead we have, more moral peacocking. You have people going, well, if you don't agree with me, then you're bad. You're a bad person. And all this othering, as the sociological theorists would call it, that's happening all the time, and both sides do it. That's dangerous, though, if you're the people in charge of the cultural institutions that actually do have real power. The mainstream media has power in this country.
So that goes to the big debate that I would always have, and my own opinions in it would shift constantly. I remember when I was working in a little political media startup with two other guys. One of them was a conservative, and the other one was a progressive, and I was the kind of the wild card between them. And the conservative used to be I think a managing editor in Free Beacon. He used to bring up the classic conservative grievance about liberal hegemony and control of the cultural mainstream. And the response to that would be like, yeah, but, the populist force of right-wing media is enormous. You can't just keep going to the well of liberals control the mainstream elite as a perpetual excuse for an inferiority complex. True, they have outsized influence in some established elite institutions, but their audience is shrinking. Their real-world democratic influence is diminishing practically in many parts of the country. How can you underestimate just how powerful conservative media is in that sense? And conservative media is maybe at our current moment, and maybe generally true, more attuned to populist outrage that you're describing.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
This argument about the responsibility that the media elites need to hold themselves to, or partly because they pretend to hold themselves to these higher standards, is used to exonerate bad behavior, or at least to shrug off responsibility for the cheap fomenting of outrage and sometimes violence under the excuse that we are just giving voice to the unheard. I just see that also as a reckless abdication of elite responsibility just on the right. Some versions of this
I agree.
More reckless than others, like Big R regime.
Oh, I hate that. Don't get me started on the regime talk. But this is actually a really important point, because I think right now, I think you're right. And the thing about conservative media is that it's still in a weirdly unhealthy and parasitic relationship with the mainstream media, simply because it hasn't built up over generations cadres of reporters and journalists who kind of came of age through institutions that encourage the same values that conservative media wants to promote.
And Tucker Carlson originally wanted to do that, right? With Daily Caller. Right. That was the vision.
That was the vision. And it's really strange how reactionary a lot of outlets, some were born and raised to be reactionary. That was their purpose. But I think that's a real weakness of conservative media still, is that there is not that cultivation of that kind of solid, objective reporting, the kind of thing that it's very easy to criticize the mainstream media when they fail to do that. So I guess my beef with mainstream media, though, remains because I'm conservative and I do largely I consume mainstream media. Look, I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post every day. Those are my three papers. And it is shocking to me how the shift in narrative building in mainstream media now is, I think, what gets a lot of the populist outrage types going. And it's real. It's not simply it's certain things are not allowed to be talked about kind of theme. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, we don't say this. And if you're a person living in a city, for example, where there was a lot of rioting or where crime rates have spiked, and you're reading your paper and it's like, it's really not a problem. That's what you're reading. You're thinking, but I look out my window and I see it's a problem. Where are the people who are speaking to my concerns? Politicians are having this problem too, but they're at least accountable at the voting booth. People who control media institutions are not in that same way. As Vanessa said, it's a private enterprise. It's driven by clicks and profit making. So you're absolutely right. I think I agree entirely with your criticism of conservative media, but I do think it's healthy. Remember, this is a democracy where in its early days, every political party had its own newspaper that was published that was completely partisan on its own side. Maybe in some ways our attempt to think we're above partisanship and that there is such a thing as objective media was just a blip, right? Of the sort of mid 20th century, late into early 21st century blip, and it might be gone now.
To put your feet to the fire a little bit, Christine, because you said that you're very good at pointing out problems, but less good at pointing out solutions, which I think we all do. But do you see a solution? I mean, I threw out a public media system, but like, what are ways that the incentives just aren't there to fix the problem, it seems?
Yeah, I think, well, for one thing, conservative media has an obligation to train, to recruit, to train, and to insist on objective reporting if it's going to hold the mainstream media's feet to the fire. And that does require money. I mean, in order to have a foreign bureau overseas, you have to have a media institution that can afford to send people there and keep them safe and allow them to do their work. And right now, most of the mainstream media outlets, they're even cutting back on that, right? I mean, honestly, if I could do one solution, if I was a billionaire and I could create one solution, it would be to go back to encouraging and nurturing local journalists. So this is one area where I think social media has actually been effective because it's allowed local people. Here in DC, we have this guy, DC Real Time News, who just started out with a Twitter handle. He has a full-time job, but he just would drive around and he'd show up at crime scenes and he'd ask questions and he'd post stuff on his Twitter feed. And now he works for a local news outlet too. But he was just a guy who in his neighborhood was not seeing local issues covered in the way he wanted. So he did it himself. And that impulse is real. That's such a wonderful American entrepreneurial impulse too. He's not getting paid. He's doing it because he cares about it and his community cares about it. And we've lost a lot of that kind of local journalist sensibility. That's also the places where young journalists could learn their trade. They had to go to city council meetings. They had to sit in boring places and report on boring things that actually were very important for civic governance. And I think if you have a 20-something who comes out of an Ivy League school and is dropped at a news reporting desk at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal and has been raised to believe that they are fighting injustice as a journalist, but hasn't done the work, there can be huge gaps in the questions they don't even know what they don't know to ask. And so that's where, if I had a solution and I had the money to do it, I would invest in kind of nurturing the local newspaper or the local, I guess it would all be a local website now, but right. Local journalism.
I mean, I think part of it has to be also, at some point, conservative media has to grow out of its,
toddler fate, angry toddler.
Right. It's arrested development, or to foreshadow our conversation, it's grievance trauma.
Yes.
The way I imagine it, it's like a kid who grew up with a parent that was constantly berating and somewhat abusive, saying, you're not going to amount to anything, you're a loser. But now the kid is 40 and a successful doctor, multimillionaire, but still gets shattered every time they go on the phone with their parents. Like they would throw a tantrum, you ruined my life. I'm like, no, your life is good. You're fine.
Well, yeah. Well, victim status in our culture, and Christopher Lasch wrote about this several generations ago now, and he was spot on then, and it's still true now. Victims have status now. So if you're a conservative, writer, you want to play the victim just as much as everybody else does, right? It's like, oh, I'm the subject of X, Y, or Z bias, or that. It's such an easy and comfortable position for people to step into. We've all done it. I mean, it's again, I go to the human nature point, but I do think you're absolutely right that conservative media needs to grow out of the constant grievance, because for example, I'll cite, Barry Weiss, for example, who's not a conservative, but is someone who actually is trying to build something new. She's like, I was here at the New York Times. I didn't fit in. We had a lot of ideological stuff. So she left, and she didn't do it and she could have spent the rest of her career being paid by conservative places to go give talks complaining about the New York Times. Mm-hmm. She didn't do that. She's younger. She's like, I'm going to build something new and I'm going to take a gamble. And she's doing that. That's actually the attitude I would like to see more of on the conservative side, not just pointing the finger, but saying, okay, now here's what we're going to do to fix it. And look, places like the Free Beacon, other new little scrappy places, they're trying to do that. They're trying to build something new.
To some extent, the Washington Examiner does some great reporting.
Yes,
but okay. The thing is that they'll always have a side that will pander to the grievance, because it's just part of the bread and butter. The journalism is the cherry on top. Okay, so the episode is probably going to be released in a week. So who knows what's going to happen politically in this time, if we'll even be here.
Dom, you're just catering to the doom listeners.
That's where we get the subscribers, clearly.
I guess, actually, when I think about it, we are. That's our bread and butter, too. The doominess.
Mild gloom. Ennui. We're more in the ennui business.
Oh, there you go. That's better.
So there's been a lot of news recently, but we don't know much about it. I'm kind of in a purgatory state of information when it comes to the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago. The Justice Department has retrieved a bunch of documents, and as far as we know, they're Schrodinger's documents. We have no idea whether what they contain is important or not. And as far as I'm concerned, nobody should have, or at least voice publicly, an opinion about this because we have no idea what's in those documents. Nevertheless, opportunists on the left have been using it to stoke the excitement of the law is finally closing in on Trump. They finally got him, while the right was fanning the flames of defund the FBI, of all things, and civil war. My question to you, in a moment like this where a total dearth of information has been filled by empty partisan outrage, how should an average news consumer navigate this uncertainty?
Not to sound like an after-school special, which does date me age-wise, but there's a kind of teachable moment here in that. And it's very difficult not to leap to conclusions because everything about how we consume news and everything about our current cultural environment makes present circumstances always more important than what came just before or what might come just after. So this constant hyper-presentism is really difficult when we have uncertainty. And if you add, in this particular case, particularly the Justice Department and the FBI as an institution, we know just from surveys over the last 5, 10, 15 years that Americans' faith in a lot of our institutions is on the decline. It's been going on for a while. It accelerated during the pandemic. And that includes law enforcement at every level. And it's been interesting to me I've had a lot of squabbles both on air and off with my colleagues at Commentary Magazine about this because I understand when a sort of Trump supporting, don't happen to be a Trump supporter myself, but when Trump supporting people look at the FBI, there's a whole history there with regard to how the FBI handled itself during the Trump presidency that can and should make them suspicious of anything that happens. And they don't have the patience to sit by and wait. They're instantly going to condemn it. My problem is with the fact that elected officials, leaders of this country, should not be doing that at all. Their job is to say, we'll wait and see what happens. We don't know. We, of course, have concerns about how the FBI has behaved in the past. We're going to just have to wait and see. And to keep people calm. It's obviously not. I mean, elected members of Congress saying some of the things they've said in the last few days is appalling. It's astonishing. But I would hope that what people can do now is think about whatever comes out of this, how we rebuild that trust in institutions. Because ultimately, whether you're on the left or the right, that's eroding. And that's bad for everyone. Because if we don't trust our law enforcement institutions to do the right thing, if we don't trust the people who are in charge at the very upper echelons of leadership to be honest with the public when they're asked to answer questions about what's going on, that's bad. Because, if you sweep out every Democrat and stuff Republicans in there, that trust problem is still there. It's still there. So that's what really worries me, that trust in Congress is on the decline, in the Supreme Court, in the presidency. Like, these are all important and valuable institutions. This is the heart of democracy. And I worry about that. And so this is another one of those cases where I think our media environment encourages us to rush to judgment and to choose sides. And you can't do that yet. There's just simply not enough information.
Can it be restored when, even if any attempt to agree on first principles, I think would be somewhat disingenuous, at least from the political class. Mm-hmm. I think most normal people would just want a functioning government and would probably agree on what that entails. It means we want an FBI, we want policing, and we want it to also be fair, and we want it to not be biased either by race or politics or by class or what we want it to be.
Exactly.
Equally dispense justice. That's a shocking desire for her. And we want order and safety in our society, and we want corrupt people to be removed from power. Yep. So yeah, that's normal people.
Sounds like a good platform, Adam. You're ready.
There you go. 2024, man.
The basic party.
The basic bitch party.
Oh, I like that. I would vote for that.
Yeah, me too. The problem is that the political class, and I include media in it, is being disingenuous. When one side says, and that hypocrisy applies to both, when one side says, we just want impartial enforcement, they don't actually mean that, because both sides have shown over the past 20 years just how unperturbed they are. with partial enforcements when the target is their political enemies or just causes they don't care about.
Well, this is a good point, because I think what it points to is two larger crises that are going that are at the heart of the decline in trust in institutions, and that's a crisis of evidence. People don't trust evidence, and because they vet who the evidence comes from, who said it, where did it come from, and the legitimacy crisis. Because I would distinguish between at this point, a Trump supporter who is like, I really don't trust the FBI. That's a totally legitimate thing for that person to say. But to say the FBI is illegitimate is different. That's undermining an institution that this nation, we need some sort of Federal Bureau of Investigation to keep order, as you said. So I think that again, we go to language, we go to the tone, but those two crises, the fact that we don't agree on what facts are, is really, really a problem here, because again, we hear spin and we're served up a constant diet of narratives from either side. And then you choose your narrative, and then you got to stick with your narrative. And then when evidence appears that undermines your narrative, you have to make a choice. Am I going to stick with the narrative, or I'm going to rethink it? This whole podcast is about rethinking, when evidence comes in, going, maybe uncertainty is actually a really important democratic value, particularly in policymaking. But that, I do think our media environment is the opposite of that.
Mm. Shall we get into trauma, Adam? Let's do it.
I'm feeling already
You're
triggered.
To say.
Primed for some trauma talk.
So I think a funny way to start it, I had
You had segues in mind. I'm so sorry.
I had drinks with a friend of the pod, Batya Sargon, the other day, and she said during the conversation something about your PTSD. And it took me a second to think, what PTSD is that? Oh, right. She meant the thing that happens sometimes when I lose sleep, because I grew up in Jerusalem during the Second Intifada, and buses and coffee shops were exploding all around. One bus right next to my high school. Some friends from high school were killed, family members. And today, sometimes, for instance, when the war in Ukraine broke, it can evoke some of that anxiety. But I would never think to refer to it honestly, sincerely, publicly as a PTSD. Having seen real PTSD, the kind that friends who went to the army come back with, people who actually saw war or experienced sexual abuse, people whose entire life is now debilitated because of the condition, what I'm experiencing is just anxiety. Who in the world doesn't experience anxiety? Who in the world doesn't have some formative bad experiences that still sometimes come to haunt them? Doesn't matter if it's being in Jerusalem in 2003 or being in a bad relationship. It could be anything, but that's normal. That's not PTSD. And so the context of this rant is that I think we've all noticed that trauma as a concept has completely saturated the popular culture, as well as the political sphere. Every bad experience that has a lingering effect is seen as the traumatic result of a violent act. In popular culture, in personal interactions, in politics, it's as if we don't have a way to find value or to assess a situation or a relationship without reading it through the lens of damage and trauma and PTSD. I think you can tell that I have a very negative opinion of this development. But you wrote the commentary article about it. What do you think?
Well, actually, I ended up writing this piece. If you write and you think about ideas a lot, I keep little gatherings of string. I gather string on certain ideas. And this one I've been gathering off and on for some time. It started with, I have close family members and a few very good friends who have experienced the kind of trauma that you're describing, whether it was seeing combat, violent assault, the kinds of things that I think as a society and a culture, we always understood to be traumatic. That's how the word was used. Soldiers who had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's something that's a real, or people who've been the victim of violence and had that kind of diagnosed experience and struggled with it, because it is a struggle. And I started to become very annoyed when I'd see this term pop up in And it actually started with a friend who's a vet who we were in a group conversation and someone said, oh, I totally have PTSD because they didn't have this brand of soap at the Whole Foods or something. And I saw him get like tense. This is a very laid back guy. And I later asked him, I'm like, are you okay? And he's like, I hate when people say that. He said, he just said, it just bothers me because I don't think they understand what trauma is and we shouldn't use that term. And that's what got the gears working for me. And at the same time, I have a completely shallow but totally obsessive focus on the crazy kind of self-care stuff we see in our culture. This sort of everything is self-care, right? Like you can be a total jerk to your friends. You'd be like, but it's self-care. I had to be honest. It's my true self. This idea of performative authenticity started at a certain point just a few years ago to really merge with the trauma talk in a way that I thought was really pernicious for understanding both what individual people need to be healthy individuals and also what we owe to the people in our society who have been victims of genuinely traumatic experiences. So there were a couple books, but also
just because just to stay on that point about the combination with the self-care, it's pernicious because it makes cultivating your trauma as central to your identity crucial to the curation of your brand.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you see this on TikTok. TikTok has this whole thing of like people who talk about their trauma and tell you what to do about, oh, this was traumatic, this was traumatic. And it's literally a personal identity, a personal brand, and decisions flow from that. Also, it allows for permanent victim status. So you can, anytime you don't turn an assignment in, and I know this from my friends who are teachers, both at the secondary education level and beyond, they'll say, people go, well, I'm a victim of trauma, so I could not get this turned in on time. What do I do with that? Like, I mean, I don't know this person's story. I don't want to know. That's private information. So it's actually a card people play in a very, I think, kind of obnoxious way to get out of responsibility. But it's also, I think, a way, and I've seen this in policymaking. This is what finally led me to write the piece. Policymakers, elected officials, using it as a shorthand for a particular political program that they want to see passed, that if you disagree with it on policy terms, which is totally legitimate, you're actually someone who's going to traumatize other people because they'll say that's trauma. It's policy trauma to not to not forgive all student loan debt. I'm like, there are legitimate reasons to argue against forgiving all student loans, and we can have that discussion. But as soon as you say you're traumatizing someone, the discussion ends because that person's feelings have come have entered the chat, as they say, and you're not allowed to question them. So that's where that weird, and then we have this whole thing about The Body Keeps the Score, this best-selling book that started out as written by a guy who himself has now said we've gone way too far with the trauma talk, but who was talking about the physiological experience of trauma. Can you pass trauma down through generations? There are fascinating experiments looking at that, but there's no consensus at all about a lot of this stuff. And he wrote this book that raised a lot of fascinating issues, and he talked about the therapy he's done with trauma victims. But it's become a bestseller because people want to see themselves in that story. They're like, yeah, I've had trauma too. I got dumped by a guy and it was really hard on me. And I'm like, that's not trauma. As you said earlier, Adam, that's life. Life sometimes really sucks. That doesn't mean it's a trauma.
Right. Because the if I understand correctly, and Vanessa read the book more deeply. I just perused.
I'm like halfway through it right now, actually.
It's an interesting book. He's an interesting guy.
Right, but if I understand correctly, Van der Kolk's point is not just about defining trauma. It's about exploring the idea of trauma being imprinted on you physiologically.
Yeah, generational trauma.
Right. Even without getting into the generational question, it looks at the physiology of how trauma gets imprinted.
Exactly. Well, and as you said, if you've had an experience that's left some sort of trauma, that's the waking up in the middle of the night with your heart racing and recalling some other event that physiologically might have embedded itself in you in a way that might make future functioning more challenging. And that's what he's looking at. There's a lot of fascinating research on it. But again, there's also been a lot of overreach in our cultural conversation about that. So you see people taking that idea, which is yet to be completely proven, but has some fascinating issues circulating around that the researchers are exploring. And they say, well, my grandmother was the victim of racism, and so I am traumatized by that, and I need special treatment as a result. No. That's not what they're arguing. Now, intergenerational racial trauma is one of the things that researchers are looking at. They're looking at a lot of those issues. They're looking at some of the most fascinating research is when a traumatic event happens to a woman when she's carrying a child. what happens to that child? Is there any expression of that trauma when the child starts to grow up? Fascinating research. But that's very different from what we're seeing culturally, politically, and socially in terms of discussing trauma.
So I brought this question up with with our friend Misha Thomas, as I mentioned, because I think foundational to our friendship, both personal and intellectual, was us arguing about this issue of trauma for like 6-7 years ago.
And again, he's a psychologist,
Yes.
so he actually deals with people diagnosed with
traumatic
disorders.
I think it's his one of his obsessions. This is his hopefully soon to be written book. So I asked him for his top line thoughts on this. He puts it as, we are too lazy. I'm paraphrasing, but he says we are too lazy in separating the literal diagnostic trauma from the metaphorical. I wonder what you think about that. But isn't a lot of the talk of trauma basically kind of just a... we talked about words matter earlier, but isn't just a basic expansion of the word to just mean I've had a bad experience? Or sometimes even this trauma is this Westworldy core memory that my entire identity is constructed around. I think it's a common thing that we have some memories that we can still trace current decisions back to. So maybe what happened to the word trauma, the way it got abused, was that it was just stretched and expanded to basically mean that, to be the literary tool that denotes our backstory.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think I think the challenge is that the impulse to help someone who's suffering, someone who is in pain, is a really good one, right? That's empathy. Like it's looking at someone who says, "I am suffering," and saying, "Okay, let's try to give that a name so that it's understood not just by you who's suffering, but by other people who might be able to help you." That part of the trauma talk, I don't mind. I get that. I get why people want to say this is trauma, because they are suffering in some way, and they're trying to figure a way through their suffering. I guess what concerns me is that culturally we always have these incentive structures that develop that reward certain behaviors over others. And I was thinking back to, it wasn't that long ago, right, that every other book about kids was like, you have to have grit, you have to be resilient. It's all grit, resilience, tough, tough, tough. And then suddenly now it's, this kid needs extra time on a test because he was bullied in second grade and now he's got to take the SAT. So I was like, how did we get there so fast? And I do think, again, we're getting, it's a kind of, we've used the word grievance and victim a lot in our conversation today. And I think there's a strain of kind of rewarding being a victim because it's a clear position. It's a clear moral high ground to say, I've been victimized in this way. But what worries me is that undermines what we even understand to be victimized. Being a bad name is not being made a victim. It's nothing akin to being the victim of a violent crime, for example.
You brought in the point of grit and resilience. What's your response to the argument that this is, a reaction to a part of American culture that fetishized grit and resilience to an unhealthy degree? Put aside the question of generational trauma, and you are not allowed to use the metaphor of swinging pendulums.
Right. Good. You should always ban that from any discussion. No, I think it is probably in some ways a reaction to that. It's a reaction in some ways to the sort of fallout from the self-esteem movement that was inculcated in children in particular in the late 20th and early 21st century. But there's a danger to the trauma talk in that exists in a way that didn't with the resilience and grit talk. You can say to someone, it's better to be tough and resilient. And that can be hard. That can be harmful to a person who has suffering from mental health issues or who has any other challenge for which that message will just freak them out and make their problems worse, right? But when you talk about, when you tell a generation, particularly of young people who are at that moment in life, I'm thinking here of like, they're just out of high school age, they're figuring out what the rest of their life should look like. If you inundate them with a message that the struggles of everyday life are akin to trauma, you are basically silencing the people who have suffered real trauma, because it's defining trauma down. That undermines people who really are suffering from real trauma. And it gives a moral and an undeserved moral high ground to people who just don't want to deal with their issues and say, oh, this life sucks. because it's going to give them, one day they'll realize that. But if it's been swaddled in trauma talk, I don't think it's fair to them. It doesn't actually allow them the chance to see if they have a certain amount of resilience. So I agree. I think a lot of the grit talk was annoying at the time. I have 2 boys and they're very different personalities. They're twins and they're different personalities. And it always struck me as hilarious because I'd read something. I'm like, well, that might apply to this one, but this one is not going to go for that. So I have a behavioral science experiment, in real time all the time. So yeah, it's good that we're talking more about mental health in particular, particularly for young people right now. But we've gone, I'm not going to say pendulum, but the trauma talk angers me not because the benefits that I think the people who use it think they're getting do not outweigh the harm it's causing to genuine trauma victims.
And you're saying the harm is not equal and opposite. It's worse.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The thing that it makes it's difficult for me to wrap my head around is when are you compassionate to someone versus when are you coddling someone? And I'm thinking about the examples that you gave of extra time for a test or not handing in an assignment. It's how are we supposed to be the arbiters of what trauma is legitimate, when someone's actually suffering something legitimate that requires our compassion and leniency versus when people are exploiting a kind of cultural moment in order to be lazy or something. But I don't understand how we're supposed to be. For me, I would always err on the side of compassion because I just won't know. And potentially I'm going to be coddling a lot of people in my surroundings because of that uncertainty.
So I think as individuals, we should always err on the side of compassion. Absolutely. If I'm the teacher who has a kid who's kind of trying to pull one over on me, I'll think, well, what's the harm? Down the line, they're going to learn this lesson. One day they're going to say that to a boss, and they're going to lose their job, and then they'll learn that lesson. But so I think as individuals, we should always err on the side of compassion. My concern with the trauma talk in particular is that it's being institutionalized in policymaking and in kind of cultural institutional ways that could potentially be harmful to those people in a structural way. So what I mean by that is, this is going to sound like a strange example, but bear with me because I was born and raised in Florida and I went to Walt Disney World a lot as a kid. They used to have a special line for people in wheelchairs. If you had any mobility issues at all, you went to the front of the line. Nobody minded that. I remember as a kid, watching, there were always people who were being wheeled to the front of Space Mountain and you're like, oh yeah, it's great that they can ride the ride. Well, in recent years, they've had to completely overhaul the way that they give passes for that because people who could afford to do so were literally hiring disabled individuals to get to the front of lines. The whole family would go to the front of the line. They were hiring people would hire themselves out. They'd be, to do that. And Disney figured this out and was like, what? So there's a thing where you've erred on the side of compassion. You're trying to help people who need a little assistance. And it's completely exploited by horribly selfish people. So then the whole system has to change and they have a more rigorous process now, all for the good. But I always think of that when I think about what harm does it do? It doesn't until it reaches a tipping point. It's what's the harm in my driving a huge gas guzzling SUV? I could do what I want. But if every single person drives one of those cars, there is a social effect that we all have to bear regardless of whether we drive an SUV. And I feel with the trauma talk, we're not there yet. But I wanted to raise at least a little red flag that we don't want to go any further in that direction.
And there's the layer of this is not necessarily, or I should say, that a lot of the remedies that come out of this, remedies to help heal trauma, aren't really necessarily helpful or geared towards the people with the original trauma that we were talking about, like people who experienced war or sexual abuse. Instead, a lot of the current day trauma therapy seems to be geared towards people's petty inconveniences.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right.
Right. Self-care won't fix trauma.
Yes, exactly. Well put.
But on the policy side, Christine, where do you see kind of trauma informing policy and it potentially having negative consequences?
So the 2 areas that I would highlight that I've seen it most recently, educational pedagogy. So you see a lot of we have to have trauma-informed this or trauma-informed that. So my first question is always when I read something like that, well, how do you define trauma? What's your definition of trauma? Who qualifies for that definition? And what does it mean to be trauma-informed? If that just means you're on the lookout for kids who might have some expressions of having had some traumatic experience, that's fine. Good educators should always do that. But if it means that you're kind of actively seeking out individual trauma in your students to make sure that they know that they're suffering and this needs to be fixed, that's a different set of priorities. So I worry a little bit about how the throwing around of trauma-informed this and that, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, where a lot of young kids are still suffering their mental health issues. They're still suffering academically and socially. So our kids need a lot of help right now. And so I worry about that becoming the sort of shorthand to sweep under the rug a lot of issues that have practical, like they need tutoring in math and reading. They need some mental health support in very specific ways. To say, oh, now we have we got all this money, we're going to have a trauma-informed curriculum. I think that's kind of an easy way out for a lot of these institutions. The other area, and on this I become quite passionate about it, is in crime. So if you live in a city where you have a victim support service, if you've been the victim of a crime, usually you have some support service you can contact in law enforcement that will say, okay, like they support crime victims. They keep them up to date on things like when, if they've arrested someone and they're going to go on trial, when's the trial? Are they on parole? When are they going to be paroled? Can I testify about this? All of these services that are there to help someone who through no fault of their own has been traumatized by being the victim of crime. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing in a lot of places is a devaluation of those services for those victims in favor of talking about the trauma that a perpetrator might have had that caused him to commit a crime. And I see this living in a city where, our juvenile laws in particular allow someone up to the age of 25 to claim, well, I'm a child, so I shouldn't be held responsible for the fact that I, raped or beat someone. I have a real problem with that because I'm hear from people who seek victim services from the state and can't get them, can't really get the support they need. Meanwhile, a lot of tax money is going to help support, people who are accused of pretty terrible things. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have a rehabilitative aspect of our criminal justice system. We absolutely should. But again, it's about weighing where's the balance there? Are you spending all your time in social and cultural focus on the people who are committing the crimes and trying to solve, in an effort to solve that problem? What happens to the victims? Where is their voice? Where's their support? Are they just kind of left on their own to figure it out for themselves? Unfortunately, in a lot of places, they are, simply because the resources are being redirected or the resources just aren't there. And that worries me too, because if you've been the victim of crime, you know this. You need to see someone in the system saying, I see you, I know what happened to you, and we are going to help you. People who commit crimes need a certain kind of social support as well, but it's different from what we should be. The way we talk about it, what we do should be different for those people than for the people who have been victimized through no fault of their own. So that's another area where I really get the trauma talk has really infused rehabilitative justice discussions in a way that I think isn't going to help us going forward.
In a way, it also it inverted the whole concept of trauma in a way. It took it from somebody who was, here's an immediately inflicted harm that we can measure and the justice system was created to redress, into no, we can't really redress it because there is some vague trauma or contextual ambient trauma that may have precipitated the act, the crime.
Right. And it's not wrong. I mean, a lot of people who commit crimes have themselves been the victim of traumatic events in their absolutely.
The whole history of criminology is around those questions.
Exactly. But that's why the language that we use has to be we have to be disciplined about what we're talking about here. And especially when we're talking about victims. So you can be someone who's been the victim of childhood trauma. You grow up and you make a choice to do something that breaks a law and that harms another human being. It's not that your trauma doesn't matter. And it usually comes into play in sentencing. Judges weigh that. That's why we have, during sentencing, judges listen to testimony from relatives and whatnot. But that is a very different experience. That if you've committed an act to harm another person, you don't get a get out of jail free card just because you were also traumatized. Most people who are traumatized don't do that. They don't make that choice. They don't go around victimizing more people. So we have to distinguish that. We have acts of right and wrong, and we can't excuse that using a language that actually really more applies to a victim of crime rather than a perpetrator.
So where do you see and how do you understand this flattening of the moral examination of crime, where people seem to be narrowly concerned with either the criminal or the victim, but never both as part of a more complicated story of justice and trauma?
Well, I think actually this is an area kind of like historians in a way, but there's really creative and interesting academic and scholarly work being done in criminology and in criminal justice right now. And it's not politicized in quite the way that I think people assume it would be, because the best of it does something really interesting. It encourages people to hold two contradictory thoughts at the same time, to say, okay, if you have, for example, a really violent, crime-ridden neighborhood, you got to do two things. You got to deal with the underlying systemic issues in that neighborhood, whether it's poverty, racism, any number of things going on in that neighborhood. At the same time, you got to arrest and convict and put away the people who are being violent. Both of those things have to happen. And in a very polarized world where, sensationalism sells, you see that becoming political. So you got one side of the aisle going, it's all systemic. If we deal with poverty, no one will kill each other anymore. So we don't need cops because we protect ourselves. I'm like, that's crazy. Like, that's just not, again, human nature teaches us that that's not possible. But then the other side thinks, well, these are just individuals making bad choices and we punish every single one of them. And, we won't worry about the underlying things that we might better, the support and the money that we might spend on neighborhoods and on people who can go into those neighborhoods and help those people see a different future for themselves, and on rehabilitating, giving options for incarcerated people to earn a degree and to have employment afterwards. All those things, those should be conservative values too. That's not just a progressive idea. That should also be a conservative idea because it's better for society and it conserves moral principles of what we owe each other that actually used to be conservative. So that, I think, if we could I would like to hear more from the criminologists and the criminal justice scholars who do this stuff on the ground. And there are a number of programs where they've seen success doing both. They partner with the police and with local groups, and they say, okay, how are we going to stop this? The police say, we're going to give you a chance, but if you blow it, you're going to go to jail, and we can't do anything about that. But if you come to us before a beef is going to be settled with guns and we can intervene and help, nobody goes to jail, nobody gets killed. Like, we can work, and the groups work with them. This works. It's very hard work. It takes a lot of dedication, determination, and it's really hard to do in such a polarized political environment.
Sure. Reminds me of the Amsterdam Compromise in The Wire.
Right. Classic.
I mean, yeah. But I guess there should be like a big ding here every time that I get to say cognitive dissonance is the answer.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I didn't want to interrupt you, Christy, but I was like, I'm so happy.
I was doing jazz hands behind.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance, jazz hands.
That's my hobby horse.
I think we need to make a sound effect for it.
Right, exactly. The ominous sound effect for Chomsky, and then triumph for cognitive dissonance. But it's so you see it as it gets stuck when people can't see the whole picture. And it's funny because the problem with cognitive dissonance is that it creates that internal tension that people can't really handle, which kind of configures into the big victim complex of like discomfort is unhealthy. That also fits with the problem with, speaking of diluting words, of violence becoming a horribly abused word. And in your article, you mention the phenomenal phrase policy violence.
Yes. Yeah. This is something I've been seeing in some federal legislation that's been proposed lately, and I don't like it. Just like I don't. Oh, yeah. Policy violence if you don't agree with XYZ number of proposals. There's no such thing as policy violence. You can talk about bad policy that might lead to violence. You can talk about good policy that can prevent violence, but there's no such thing as policy violence. This is the same frustration I feel when people say silence is violence, but then they also say words are violence. I'm like, no, just like, let's get away from those Manichaean ways of even thinking about this stuff, right? Violence is part of human nature. We will always wrestle with it. We will never get rid of it. There are ways to tame and socialize, and that's culture's role. Culture and the family and institutions. That's what we're supposed to do, is to try to, we're descended from angels, right? We're really not angels ourselves. We are constantly battling that in as individuals and as a society. And we are a uniquely violent society if you compare to others. But we're a lot less violent than we used to be. And where historically, in the kind of like many thousands of years scale, humans are doing better than they used to be too. So I think we need, again, perspective is important. But if you're going to talk about violence, you cannot, that's another term I don't want to see defined down. I don't want to see that defined down and thrown around. Violence is a specific thing. It's just like the term truth. You don't have my truth. You don't have post-truth. You have truth and you have untruth. So we love to mess around with words, and I'm getting very semantic here, but words matter. Words have power, and we need to be careful in how we use them, particularly in policymaking.
I was just gonna ask, because it seems like a lot of what we're talking about is dilution of words, meanings shifting, changing. But I mean, this is kind of a thing that language does. It evolves, it shifts, it moves, it takes on different meanings. I mean, barring everyone essentially self-censoring all the time, I mean, how are we supposed to effectively police our language when it seems to be kind of taking on cultural life all of its own?
No, it's a good question. I think I don't have problems with individuals using language however they want, and expanding. And I mean, actually, so much creative work is doing just that. I start to want to draw a line when it comes to those in power and in policymaking, because there are real world consequences for people who don't have any say. I mean, if you put a word in a bill that has some sort of criminal punishment attached to it, and someone falls afoul of that law and argues, but I wasn't this, and the bill says that's what that is now. I mean, now we're getting into Orwellian territory, but that's where words actually start to have a power and a potentially punitive effect on people who see, if you think this means X and the law says it means Y, that starts to have a lot of conflict. And again, it speaks to like undermining institutions. So I think this idea that we have common words and we have a common understanding of it has always been kind of a fiction. But at the very least, we have to have the debate. The culture is gonna come to a point where we're like, everyone's traumatized. There's a book coming out actually soon that's basically like everyone's traumatized. Whatever, we're
it's
all
like everybody poops.
Exactly.
It's like everyone's
the everybody poops of pop psychology. That book's coming out. So fine, then that's the kind of cultural agreement we'll get to, and I'll just be the crank saying I don't like this. But I don't think we have the agreement because we're not actually having honest debates, right? So this stuff is sneaking its way into things, and when you challenge it, you're actually accused of re-victimizing someone. The re-victimization thing is very powerful. If you say, I have a question with how you're using the word trauma, well, you're re-victimizing me because I've experienced trauma. Well, where do you go with that? What do you do with that?
So I want to take it to the culture question. We talked about the important things. We talked about I expressed my frustration about the important things at the top. One aspect that we didn't talk about is how much it's ruining fun stuff. I really loved what's her name? Parul Segal's article in the New Yorker. I think you also quoted talking about the trauma plot as basically being, I mean, it used to be a clutch for lazy writers to give characters depth on the cheap, but it has become way more than that. And it's now basically the dominant storytelling device in TV, in literature, in film, American at least, where a character is not much more than the sum of its traumas. And it's funny because it fits with what we said earlier about the trauma being used both as a status symbol and as a way to broadcast your personality. What's good for TikTok influencers is good for Ted Lasso.
Yeah, I loved that article because it just laid out the underlying theme. You read between the lines of that article, and it's a lament. It's a lament for the kind of literature, the kind of storytelling where the reader is given the wonderful privilege of trying to figure out some things about the characters, him or herself, right? So you can read something. I just recently reread Middlemarch, one of my favorite novels of all time, and I haven't read it in about 10 years. And to read one of those books when you've aged and matured and hopefully gotten a little more wisdom is just so revealing. Suddenly you're like, oh, I really don't like that character. That character is actually really passive aggressive in a way I never saw when I was in my 20s or 30s. And so that trust that writers, I think, used to have in their readers is undermined by this insistence of, well, we know everyone's feeling. We have to signal to the reader. We're gonna assume they need to see the signal of the trauma plot because that's their own life. I mean, I read books to escape, actually. I watch great movies to escape reality. I don't really need a constant reminder of it. But I do think that it's underestimating us as readers, and that's what makes me sad. But the piece was excellent at kind of laying out again, that there's an incentive for writers to do that. The assumption is that it'll sell. And again, on this, I'll blame Oprah Winfrey with her book club. She was actually someone who popularized a lot of good things about talking openly about mental health. And obviously she's a sort of cultural phenomenon. But there was a point at which she'd gotten so many of her books were sort of trauma memoirs or trauma narratives. And that's what there was a sort of weird feedback loop where because she could move books and sell books, more people wanted to write books that Oprah would sell. And you started to see in the latter days of her book club that was most of what was coming out of it. And I think, again, the market sees that, they see books selling and they want more of it. But for authors, like, trust your readers, like, let them figure this stuff out. That's how you peel the onion in a literary character, is like trying to figure out how they define trauma is not necessarily how the readers will either.
Yeah, I also, but I mean, I'm going to go slightly the opposite, which is like, I can't help but see the positives as well, though, because I'm thinking like Oprah Winfrey specifically has history of sexual assault in her family, which she's talked about openly. And I would imagine that her talking openly, as well as preferring books in which people have gone through similar traumatic events and survived or however they've dealt with it in the books, I would imagine that actually had a very profound positive effect on many people that had gone through something similar and then now felt the ability and access to talk about it. So I guess I think I'm always kind of flip-flopping on this one, because at the same time I understand that we're overdoing it and delegitimizing actual traumas. At the other hand, I think like the more we talk about it, the more that people will be able to acknowledge traumatic events and not feel this like burden of shame around them.
I think that's right. And I think like when she produced The Color Purple, like she got that movie made, amazing movie. I guess my concern is that when do we know, when we've got, and the New Yorker piece was interesting to me because I think she was sort of, the article was basically saying, we've gotten to the point where that's the only thing we talk about now. And where have all those other stories gone? Where's all the mystery gone? And so that's actually, we never know when we've reached the tipping point, I guess. Oh, sorry, that's close to pendulum. Not allowed to talk about tipping points. Damn you, Malcolm Gladwell. But the idea that the frog in the pot boiling, can I use that one? We don't know when the water is boiling yet. So I appreciated the sort of pushback. I agree with you. And I think a lot of the open conversations about mental health and traumatic experience in particularly for our veterans, there's a whole class of people who were raised to believe they just had to stuff that stuff back in and never discuss it. Now we can talk about it. That's very good. It's good for people. But when have we gone too far?
Right. Because I don't think that the problem is that trauma is made explicit. And also, I don't think that it was absolutely lacking in literature from before the 1950s, especially in non-American literature. The things that's frustrating, and at least as I read her article and from my experience of television and books and movies, is that it's started as a clutch. I don't know how to make my character rich and dimensional, so I'm just saying, like basically take Maleficent. How do I make a childhood villain interesting? I know. She experienced a metaphor for rape. Did we gain something from this? Is she now a more interesting or deeper character? No, but we recontextualize a childhood fairy tale. So there's that. Does it change our moral understanding of our actions towards the Sleeping Beauty? Not really. And this whole cottage industry of giving old villains trauma, this nonsense that Disney's doing, aside from just being a marketing ploy for a generation that refuses to grow up, it goes back, I think, to Wicked, which is actually, as a book, phenomenal and is not at all about a singular trauma. It's really about a journey of a character where we get to see the sociological context as well as her deeper psychology in a way that completely does not excuse her actions. But now it's just, hey, there's Gaston. He has PTSD. Here's Maleficent. She was maybe raped. It's so lazy. And that kind of becomes how people tell stories. And an example from the New Yorker article that I loved was in Ted Lasso. It reached such satiation point where you couldn't just do one trauma. You had to have two characters experiencing flashbacks to their seminal traumas at the same time. Because every show gives you one trauma. We give you two.
But see, this is a really important point you make, because what we don't get from those characters, whether they're good or evil, is exactly that, the wrestling with the moral choices the characters make. And good storytelling it shows you that, it doesn't tell you. And the trauma narratives too often tell you, look, trauma. So whatever moral choices they make, remember the trauma. That doesn't actually allow you to think about how humans wrestle with moral choices. We wrestle with them every day. And there are consequences for some people in making the wrong one. And other people, terrible people, get away with things every day. That's actually the life lesson that much great literature and much great storytelling reminds us of. And it's always fascinating to me when every culture reimagines the fairy tales in a way that, just like we get the television we deserve, so we're trapped in an endless reality TV feedback loop now. But like, you get the stories you deserve, and the way that we're retelling these stories says a lot about us as a culture and about a people. And I do think we don't like wrestling with those moral choices, because we don't always come out looking great, and we do often make bad ones, and then we have to deal with the consequences. So the trauma narrative allows a little ethical escape hatch, I think, in a lot of these stories that is sort of lazy.
It's because we're traumatized as a nation.
There we go. See?
We keep reliving the same patterns.
I really loved your point. Oh my God, my microphone is dying. My computer is dying. Everything is falling apart.
Everything is terrible.
Everything is terrible. Everything is broken. So I love what you were saying, because it's the shortcut to moral relativism.
Yes, it can be. Yeah.
Because you can use the trauma plot to explore and wrestle with difficult moral questions, or you can use it to completely amputate the moral dimension from the story and say, this is no longer legitimate to be judged. This is not in the realm of moral judgment. It makes things so shallow. We talked about the political consequences, but in terms of watching television, it's just not interesting at some point. Like, I almost start wondering, what do people find in this? Because when it's not enriching the character or the story, is it now just a game, like a twisted whodunit, trying to guess what trauma the character had experienced? Ooh, was it an abusive father or a violent spouse, maybe? Okay.
Well, on that note.
I'm so glad I brought so much happy talk to the uncertain.
No, speaking of spouses. Vanessa.
What about, do we have time? We're at the end of time. Do you have more, a question for a time for one more question, or?
Me? Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So you want me to ask about marriage?
Yeah. Why not? You want to go there? Let's go there.
So Christine, I just got married. It was not a decision I took lightly, because I just don't think people need to get married. And I read your article on the New York Times marriage section. And I got the feeling from that article that you feel like marriage needs some supporters in its corner right now. Would you mind defending that position? Why does marriage need some help, and also sub question, why should people still bother to get married?
Oh, it's great. So you should know, like, full disclosure, I wrote that piece and have for many years now been divorced after 13 years of marriage. So, that's the context. And so I am not
you didn't share that detail, interestingly.
I am not an objective observer. My marriage was announced in the old-fashioned New York Times wedding announcement. So, like, I've been there, done that. Look, as a conservative-ish person, I think traditional institutions like marriage are great and should be expanded to as many. So I'm pro-gay marriage. This was always something that baffled me about the part of the conservative movement that saw this as a threat. I'm like, no, this is good. Like, the more people that want to commit in this way, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to sustain, and it's really good. It's good for the people who are part of the institution, and it's good for society to have people committed in that way, because it's a gamble on the future that's a very optimistic one. And I think we have too little optimism about the future these days. What bothered me about the restructuring of the Times announcement, so for those who don't know, it used to be very much like a social scene. Like, the people who went to the certain schools married the same people from the other schools, and they all have like
Haverford the third.
Thank
Thomas
you.
Haverford the third
has
has
yes, has
hitched up
merged
with
assets
something.
with
Eugenia something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that used to be it, and then they'd have like one vows thing, which was some quirky, cute wedding. So now they've decided to go full quirk. It's like you've got to have This actually speaks to the trauma self-care thing. So many of the couples featured now they're telling the story of their mutually or separately endured traumas and how they then came together, and marriage is going to solve all that, which of course is not why one should get married. Marriage is a different sort of commitment than that. But I was struck by how, again, I found it condescending.
Is that a real thing?
To read those.
People like announce that
they talk about their trauma in these new. Yes,
wasn't like a line in all like Gen X or 90s movies like don't use me to heal your problems. I'm not your
as
fix.
a Gen Xer. Yes, this is why I hate this new iteration. But I mean, people love it. They wanted insight. They wanted private details.
I thought that was like the Victorian idea of the men. Like, I go hunting and sometimes the gun is too loud, so now I need a soft woman to support me after this trauma.
Well,
like I thought we grew out of that.
Well, I would tell you though, there's one thing, and I wouldn't, not necessarily the Victorians, but earlier eras had something that we lack, and that's the backstage area, right? We used to have, when you go out in the world, and especially when you make a public commitment as serious as marriage, you're on stage, right? You're kind of presenting to the world, saying we are making this commitment, and the reason it's formalized in that way is to hold you accountable, but also to remind people that that's what you're doing. That's why it's important. I think it's a civic obligation as well as a personal commitment. And that's a good thing for stable societies. But now, and then you go home and you can have any kind of marriage you want. You can divvy up the responsibilities this way. You can have kids or not. You can live here. I mean, you can figure all that out on your own. That's your backstage. So what bothered me about these new announcements is they're putting all the backstage stuff in the announcement. I'm like, I just want to know, like, kind of where you got married and where you're going to honeymoon, and maybe a little bit about your background. I don't need to know all your weird quirks and like, but people love the quirks, and I guess that's why it's there. I also felt like they were kind of defining marriage down, right? It's like, well, we won't just do marriage. We'll do people who are strongly committed. I'm like, then don't put it in a wedding section. Put that in a style section story or something. Marriage is its own thing. And I have a lot of respect for it, even though mine didn't last. I would certainly don't regret it. And I know a lot of people who people remarry. Marriage is important. And I think I
want to hear a expansion or justification of that statement. Where does strong commitment veer into marriage? Is it just because of the legal commitment?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's a public commitment. So people have commitment ceremonies, but don't legally get married.
Right.
They don't get the benefits of legal marriage, which still exist in our society, even though we've tried to make it more even. But it's easier to leave. Divorce is tough. Even if it's amicable and you get along and you're like, okay, it's not working, let's move on. It's still complicated, and it's part of you have to enter the legal system to do that.
So it's really about signing onto the mutually assured destruction clause of the marriage.
There's something to that, yes, for sure. But I think congratulations, by the way. It's a wonderful thing. Let me just blow up all your romantic
mutual destruction.
No, it's very. But I actually, for me, it's a constant commitment to optimism about the future. And I love it for that. And I've attended many weddings, and I hope one day to attend my kids' weddings. And like, it's such a good thing just for that.
That's how I feel about the decision to have kids, that it is the ultimate commitment to optimism, which I'm very much on the fence on this one. I think it's kind of related to a little bit of the doominess that it involves, like, is via osmosis in my life, that it makes you think, why bring children into this?
You'll see the world with new eyes. That's why everything is new again. It's fantastic. You should totally do it.
Maybe give you a chance to finish on that, Scott, because before we give you the outro question, just because I got into an argument on the pod with the brilliant Jacob Siegel about the issue of kids, because I agree with Vanessa. I think it's such the ultimate commitment that I worry about my own ability to actually live up to it, not because of Vanessa's doominess, because I don't have that. I think kids are a wonderful thing, but I also think that I need to be in full capacity to say that my life is effectively suspended, and I need to be there for that person. And he interpreted that as being anti-natalist, which is completely not my position. Very pro-natalists. I mean, maybe some people shouldn't have had kids, but generally I'm in favor of that idea.
We're back to eugenics. Full circle.
Full circle.
But yeah, give us your, just to end on an optimistic note. What's your big thrust for natalism?
I guess I would be considered pro-natalist. I have twins, right? They just turned 16. So I only have like a couple more years where they're in the house. So all the quirks that used to drive me nuts, I'm like, oh, I'm going to find them so charming soon. But like, look, it's a gamble. But what it does, I think, particularly at this unique historical moment where we have surrounded ourselves with devices and tools that give us a constant sense of control. Like I can control this, I can press a button and get that, I can on-demand this, on-demand that. Having children blows up that worldview in a way that's so useful and healthy because you cannot control the human being they become. You can, on the margins, guide them. You're constantly guiding, and you're right that at the very beginning, trust me, I know, having two infants at the same time, I don't remember the first few years all that clearly, but you cannot control who they are. They are who they are. They emerge as this new person, and you have to deal with them on those terms. And that actually, again, this goes back to the beginning, humility. It teaches humility, and it also gives you hope in a way that I'm generally a pretty optimistic person, but every time I start to feel doom and gloom, I think I can't just give up. I've got to leave a better world, at least for these guys and their friends, they surprise you with their generosity and their everything is new to them from the moment they emerge. And it's just, it's a fascinating journey, and it has a lot of challenges, and it's not for everyone. I agree with that. But it's just, it changes you in ways you never had imagined. And I think the one cliche that's true, that everyone I know who's had kids will tell you, is that it goes by in an instant, goes by so fast. The days are long, but the years are short.
So to conclude, what do you think are the blind spots on the left and the right now?
Oh, excellent question. The blind spots on the right are assuming that there aren't broader social forces that might hobble individuals' ability to get ahead. The idea that if you just work hard enough, the sort of Horatio Alger myth, the bootstraps myth, right? I think there's a lot to that. But in fact, I think history, particularly recent history and post-financial meltdown history, shows that's not always the case. And the idea that you can just believe that the institutions will figure this out if you just have enough hardworking, meritocratic-based policies. I think the right has to start to think more systematically in a way that's thoughtful, that I think the left has been doing for years, not always correctly, but at least has been talking about systematic ways in which people are prevented from being their best selves. On the left, the big blind spot is the recognition that personal responsibility is a thing. If someone makes a moral choice to commit an act that harms another person, even if there were systemic problems or trauma, whatever there is, they are still responsible. They should be responsible in the eyes of the law. They should be responsible morally for what they have chosen to do. And the excuse making on the left, I think, is starting to change a little bit on the margins, certainly in the crime debate and some other places. But that actually has led to a kind of weird condescension towards everyday people and their ability to kind of figure stuff out and do stuff for themselves. So that's what I would, off the top of my head, say are the two big blind spots.
That's awesome.
That's an excellent answer.
That was a great conversation, Christine. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. We are uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want more on this topic, you can join us as a paid subscriber on Substack. Or if you want to support us otherwise, share us with your friends and enemies. And until next time, stay sane.